Okay, I assume everybody can see the share screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. Um, Let me back up for a minute and something we talked about last week. I just want to make a couple of points. This one slide, by the way, these are on the website. All this whole presentation is, although it's usually a slightly older version, I haven't updated the latest changes that I've have on this presentation. But it will be close, and usually within a few days, probably about the time that I post the YouTube video, the updated slides will be up there at least until the next session. Because every time I look at it, I always think of something else that's worth adding or for clarification purposes. This slide, number 10, is an important slide, and we'll be coming back to the concepts on this slide many times throughout the entire course. Um, think I mentioned that Rene Descartes in the 1600s has a political statement to separate the church from the business of science. You know, he came up with this duality, which is the nature of consciousness or spirit, which was the domain of the church, and then anything that was, quote, physical would be the domain or nature of science. And to indicate whether or not something was conscious, he came up with the slogan. I always forget the Latin version of it. I won't get it right. So in English, I think, therefore I am. You've probably all heard this. And we usually talk about consciousness as what something feels like, as the phenomenal consciousness in particular. What is the taste of a strawberry? What is the color of a strawberry? What does love feel like? Whatever. But there's two sides to it, and I'll refer you to the right side of the screen. If you look at the picture, the input side is I think, therefore I am. You know, we have all these perceptual mechanisms, sight, sound, hear, touch, taste, etc. And that provides input, but and from that, that perceptual input generates thinking. But there's the other side of consciousness also, which isn't talked about that often, but it's implied. And that is, I moved, therefore, or I act, therefore I am. So I I think I didn't mention the I act, therefore I am side of consciousness. Just want to point that out. So when you say what something feels like, it includes not only the input side, but also the output side of consciousness. I act, therefore I am. Just wanted to make that point. Okay, the next slide is an important slide also, that what I said was, as far as phenomenal consciousness is, which is just the act of pure experience, not self-reflection, not metaconsciousness, and we'll get into those definitions in great detail later on. There's a spectrum, and it seems that phenomenal consciousness, what something feels like, is experienced by every one of the creatures from the lowest protozoa, single cell organism on the left, all the way up to human beings and everything in between. So, and all life has a characteristic. It metabolizes, it grows, it's not assembled, and it all starts out with a blueprint from a single zygote, which turns into differentiated cells that eventually make up the entire body. But in every one of those cells, the blueprint is identical. So life seems to have a special property. Okay. Um, do we have, is everybody here a meditator? Okay. What I'd like to do is there's a lot of different words that describe what consciousness is and the nature of consciousness. And if you queried the 8 billion souls on the planet, since everybody thinks they're conscious and thinks other people are conscious because they exhibit a similar behavior in certain similar situations, but everybody has their own definition of what consciousness means to them. And they use a lot of different words. And the whole first half of this presentation is really to come up with a common terminology. So when we really get into the metaphysics behind consciousness, you have a better understanding, and we're all on a common ground as far as understanding the nature of consciousness. So to start with, before we get in and describe it from an intellectual point of view, I just would like to refresh. Is everybody okay if we do a 10-minute guided meditation into self-reflection on consciousness? Okay, so just leave your microphones muted if you would, so in case some background noise or a phone rings or whatever, it doesn't disturb anybody else. And let's listen to this guided meditation. It's about 10 minutes long, but I want to put everybody in the right frame of mind. So when we talk about some of the concepts that follow, some of these experiences will be fresh in your mind.
Allow yourself to get into whatever position feels most comfortable to you. And when you're ready, lovingly close your eyes. Invite your awareness to start to gather inwards, becoming the observer of your breath and body, just noticing without any judgment. And if judgment comes up, perhaps just saying, or I noticed that. And then continuing to simply be present with what is. Invite the breath to feel soft and natural, flowing as freely as it wishes, and yet still at a pace that somehow feels soft and gentle. Observing how both can be true at the same time. And on your next in-breath, now allow yourself to breathe in extra deeply, taking in that deep sip of air, holding it whenever you reach the top. And when you're ready, exhale with a sigh, really letting go in that exhale. And at the bottom of that deep exhalation, just allow the breath to go back to whatever pace was feeling so good to you. Affirm to yourself, I relax. I let go. I go within now. Tune into the weight of gravity. Intentionally allowing any muscles you do not need to use right now to become slack, to let gravity do its job. And as you feel your body releasing and relaxing more deeply, you flow deeper within. Trust where your awareness flows, whether it seems to go to your heart or your belly, perhaps your mid-torso. Find a space within you that feels really good for you to rest your awareness in. being completely present with this space and this space alone. Now find within this space a spark of light and enter within it. Notice how as you do, it appears as though you have entered into the vastness of the universe. It's as if that spark of light itself is the entire infinite nature of life itself. Is it possible infinity is within you? Feel your body respond with the lightness, signifying truth for you. Sense your awareness as vast as the universe. You may even feel as though your awareness is whooshing around, moving from one space to another, one galaxy to another, one nebula to another. Your awareness may be zipping around. Try not to hold on to it and let it flow. Recognize this feeling of how you can be everywhere at once. Is it possible the universe is within you? Breathe into a sense of lightness and how this feels. Honor your recognition. Affirm to yourself, I am that I am. And begin to become aware of the sensation that your human form, the one that you are currently connected to, the one you're experiencing life through. Feel how it exists within you. Affirming I am in me. With the I signifying the body and the me signifying how vast you truly are. If this were your universe, and I believe it is, how would you make it? What would you choose? If all things are possible, and I believe they are, what would you choose? Feel the totality of you beyond your human form. Feel it gathering the resources that your human requires to be so fully expressed, to feel lit up, fully alive. You may stay in the energy of this practice for as long as you wish. And when you're ready to come out of this, do so by very slowly taking your time. Wiggle your fingers and toes. Open your eyes very slowly. And see your world with new eyes.
Okay. One of the reasons why I did that is most people are so busy with their daily lives, they never really think about what their own consciousness is like and what it's like to really introspect and think about things. And consciousness is synonymous with experience. And you just had an experience for 10 minutes. And I don't care how good you are at writing, to write what you actually experienced in the last 10 minutes could take you a lifetime. Because the only way you can fully describe your experience to somebody else is to have them experience the same thing that you just experienced. So if there's nothing else you walk away from, this consciousness being synonymous with experience is one thing that I hope you will take away when you leave this class.
Allow yourself to get
Oops,
into.
started again. Sorry. Um, all right. Since we have a small group, if anybody has any questions or you want to interrupt me or whatever, feel free to do. We'll go at whatever pace that you want to. So feel free to interrupt me. Just unmute your microphone. I put this slide up just to show that the study of the consciousness goes back probably 3,500 years to the Indus Valley in the Near East, and that's India, Pakistan, places like that. And they are way ahead of the West in understanding what consciousness is all about. You probably have heard that an Eskimo has 35 different words for snow. Anybody who lives in the lower 48 in the United States probably knows the word snow, and you put a few adjectives around it: wet snow, fluffy snow, whatever, and that's about as good as you can do. But um, for an Eskimo living up inside the Arctic Circle, their very survival depends on understanding exactly all the different types of snows and whether or not they can build shelters with it, etc. So there's a lot more words to describe the different aspects of snow. Well, the same thing has happened in the ancient Eastern traditions. They're way ahead of the West in coming up with a terminology that describes different aspects of consciousness. Okay, so let's move forward. We all know that the church claimed the realm of consciousness and spirit, and it goes back to around 381 AD at the Council of Constantinople, where the Holy Spirit was defined and promoted throughout the church. And it remained that way until 1640. I told you about Rene Descartes, the mind-body dualism to get the church out of the affairs of scientists or natural philosophers. And not much has happened in the time since then until the early 20th century with the quantum physics conundrum. And one of the early scientists, an Englishman scientist named Sir James Jean, said the universe seems to behave more like a big thought than anything made of matter. Uh, but and most of the early experiments with quantum physics couldn't figure out how to separate consciousness from what was being observed. But they really didn't know how to deal with it, came up with some theories, and nobody did much with consciousness until the 70s. Several things happened at the same time. Edgar Mitchell went to space. He had an epiphany. He felt that the nature there was consciousness, that basically there was a oneness in the universe that everything was a part of. Um, and it was a fundamental aspect of the way the universe was put together. And his experience was so profound that he formed the Institute of Noetic Science a few years after he retired from NASA. And in 1974, Thomas Nagel wrote a seminal paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? And it was the first attempt to describe what the nature of consciousness was from the perspective of a living creature besides a human being. And that started a lot of informal research into the nature of consciousness. But most people stayed away from it unless they had tenure or they were already retired from whatever research institute they were a part of, because it was still a taboo subject in most places. And finally, in 1994, the Journal of Consciousness Studies started publishing, and it now publishes, I believe it's on a quarterly basis. And then in 1995, David Chalmers, you probably heard the name, and he restated the problem, the hard problem of consciousness. How is it that matter, things made of carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, etc., can have experience? And that's what the hard problem of consciousness is. If you look on through in quantum physics and subatomic particles, there's nothing that you would find there that says, well, there's this tiny unit of consciousness that exists in all things. Same thing is true in the periodic table of the elements. There's no attribute for all the atoms over there that says, in addition to mass, charge, spin, and all the rest of those quantities that nature has defined, there's nothing that's called some proto-consciousness in individual atoms. So as a result of the efforts in the 70s through the 90s, active debates about the nature of consciousness really started. And in the present day, it's a legitimate scientific study of exploration. And there's two major theories in the present day. One is that consciousness is a byproduct of brain processes. And the other one that consciousness is matter is fundamental in that case in the universe. And the other approach is that consciousness is what's fundamental in the universe and everything is derived from consciousness. And the mainstream view is moving away from physicalism towards consciousness as fundamental, but there's a lot of inertia. Science has been very successful, and the assumptions that consciousness is a byproduct of the electrochemical processing within the brain is a very difficult thing to overcome. And it's so ingrained in most people that they don't even think twice of it. How could it be anything else? How could consciousness exist without having an engine of consciousness like a brain? Well, I personally had a tough time with that myself. It's called a substrate. What is the substrate that consciousness exists on? If it's not a brain and if consciousness is universal, what creates it? Well, that's still materialist thinking because consciousness is what's fundamental. It doesn't need anything. It's what exists. And hopefully by the time we get through all the slides in this, you'll have a better appreciation for why that is a real possibility. So going to the next problem, and the hard problem of consciousness with Chambers is basically a problem only if you believe in physicalism that the brain produces consciousness. When you get to a certain level of complexity and you have enough neurons with enough interconnections, then all of a sudden something lights up and the entity becomes conscious. And basically, why does it have to be that way? As one of the other arguments that Chalmers made is, well, why couldn't we just be zombies? Why does it have to feel like anything to exist? We can be programmed with no conscious and have no conscious experience and just move away from danger, move towards food or whatever without having anything that it feels like in the mind. So that's the hard problem. And if you're a materialist, they have no answer for the hard problem. Of course, it becomes an easy problem if consciousness is fundamental. And we'll get into that later. So what's the easy problem? Well, how does the mind integrate information and produce mental states? For example, you know that robots exist right now and they have vision and they can discern things. They can find packages on the floor, pick up the packages and insert them into a bin appropriate for that particular package. Well, they're doing that because that's relatively easy problem. How to discern objects in a sea of objects and how to distinguish one object from the next. And once you can do that, of course, then you can manipulate and move objects around. But if you look at the lower left, this is the beauty of a sunset. A robot would have no appreciation for that. And not only that, no matter how good you are with words, it's impossible to capture what the beauty of a sunset feels like. It's something that can only be experienced. It requires consciousness. So anyways, that's what the big issue is today with physicalism. And we'll have more to say because we're going to compare physicalism or materialism, which was the old word for it, with the consciousness as fundamental models in a little bit. The physicalists refer to something as qualia. What is that smallest unit that happens within the brain? Like, what is the taste of a strawberry like? That is a qualia. It's a quality of experience. What is the redness of a strawberry like? That's another qualia. So they try to break everything down as far as conscious experiences into these qualia, and you put them all together to have a complete conscious experience. Of course, nobody else can actually appreciate because all these subjective experiences are private. They're first-person perspective. They're ineffable. They can't be described in words. So we alluded to this last week, and we'll start with, well, can you be unconscious? Well, yes, there's two ways you can be unconscious. Have no existence at all, a non-living entity, if you will, or you can have no experience. Now, a lot of people would say when you're in deep sleep, you're unconscious. And it turns out that's really not true, because if you were truly unconscious, somebody poking you wouldn't wake you up. If a loud noise occurred in the room you were sleeping, you wouldn't be stirred awake. So there's some aspect of consciousness exists. And what most people would say now, even with anesthetics, it's not that you don't have experience, you're not unconscious. It's just that you don't remember the experience. So that is a fine definition between non-existence and no remembered experience. And that will become important as we get more into the presentation. So the other thing that I talked about last time was two aspects of consciousness when somebody is awake. Phenomenal consciousness, which is shared across all living creatures, from the lowly protozoa or single cell organisms all the way up through human beings and beyond, if something happens to exist beyond. Um, it's pure experience, either on the input side or the doing side, the intentional side, to make something happen. So, and we refer to consciousness as having causal power. It can either change the internal state of the thing that's conscious, or it can affect something external to it. Gravity, for example, has a causal power, but only as it affects other objects. It cannot affect itself. So it doesn't have consciousness in the sense that I'm describing it to be. So the next bullet point, what is it like to be or to do? That is the best way to define phenomenal consciousness. If you can answer that question of have an experience that answers that question, then you have phenomenal consciousness. Now, metaconsciousness is primarily associated with organisms with a brain. And a brain allows re-representation, self-reflection of experience. You can think symbolically, whether it's in images or words or whatever kind of symbols, auditory sounds, whatever you would like, but you re-represent the experience and then you can think about it from a third person perspective. So that allows the ability to evaluate, analyze, and plan experience. So very different from phenomenal consciousness, which is just to have an experience and not and any actions as a result of something you experience in phenomenal consciousness is through instinct or archetypes, as we'll talk about later when you refer to mental instincts. Okay, so it's the ability to know that you know or intend to do something. That's what metaconsciousness is. It's self-reflection. So on to the next slide. I would like to make the distinction, and hopefully you noticed this when we did the little meditation exercise, that there was somebody who was aware, and then there was something that you were aware of. So your consciousness was in a state of being, and various content moved across the screen of consciousness. So that was the content of consciousness, and that will also become important later. But ancient traditions have been saying for millennia, and even modern science is using the same terminology now. There's the experience, and actually, that's a typo. It should be the experiencer. The experiencer, that's the knower and the observer, are the person who's aware. It's the subject. And then the second aspect of it is the experiencing, the knowing of the observing. It's the process, it's the mechanics of feeling whatever it is that the experience is having. And then there's the experience. What is the object? That is which is being done to. And it can be self-referential. You can think about something, and then, for example, you can think about balloons, and then balloons may, through associations, may cause you to think about birthday parties, and then you may think about your fifth birthday party where your parents got a clown to come entertain all the guests and so on. So that's the object of the experience. The thing about consciousness, and then this is the key point when we talk about a model of consciousness later on, uh, called IIT, which is gaining a lot of respectability these days. Consciousness has causal power, either for itself or to affect something external to itself. It has causal power. I think I talked about the example before that I can develop on my computer with if I knew all the equations to create simulate a black hole or a rainstorm or a hurricane or a kidney function, whatever you would like. Just because I can do a simulation and I can see the results of the simulation about how, in the case of the kidney, uh, drinking a certain amount of water is going to cause the kidneys to extract water in the form of with waste products a certain time later with certain other chemicals dissolved in the wastewater. Um, so it's a simulation, though. It's not the thing in itself. In order to be conscious, it has to has causal power. And that will become important because I'd like to define the difference between artificial intelligence and a living creature that is conscious. Because as you will see, contrary to what the popular opinion is, AI systems are not conscious, will never be conscious. That doesn't mean they're not intelligent, and we'll see that intelligence is different than consciousness. Consciousness is a state of being, and intelligence is a state of computation. And we'll see more about that later. So the thing to remember, it's a state of being, a state of experiencing. So we have the three aspects, the knower, the known. The knower is the subject, me. The known is the object. I'm looking at my computer screen right now, and the knowing is how I'm experiencing what's on the computer screen. The apprehender, the apprehended, the apprehending. There's lots of different words. The witness, witnessed, and witnessing, another possibility. So why is the separation between the two aspects of consciousness so important? Well, as you can see on this chart, which is another version of the one that I showed you before, the degree of consciousness goes up in the vertical axis and is defined by something called phi. If you're familiar with integrated information theory, that basically the degree of consciousness, the higher the phi, the more conscious an object is. And that becomes important because there are actually developed technologies right now. If somebody was in an automobile accident and they're behavioral unresponsive, I'm sorry, it's called a locked-in syndrome, where you ask them to blink their eyes if they can hear you, whatever, but they have no motor control whatsoever. They may be conscious, and they may have a high phi, but since the only way we can determine whether something is conscious or not is by the behavior that being exhibits. So if they have no motor control, they may have a full-blown conscious life, but we might not recognize it. And they're actually developing technology now that will be able to determine that. We'll talk more about that later. So at some point, you cross the line between higher invertebrates and vertebrates, where not only does a phenomenal consciousness, what is experienced increases. Think for a protozoa, for example, it doesn't have eyes at all, so it can't see anything outside itself in the visual spectrum. On the other hand, if you think of a bee has compound eyes, thousands of little individual eyes, if you will, and how it pieces together its external world. Only a bee knows what an experience of the external world would look like through compound eyes. But the degree of consciousness is clearly increasing as the living organism gets more sophisticated. And finally, you get all the way to higher invertebrates, which have eyes like we do, and their experience in the visual spectrum is much closer to what it is in higher organisms. Now, above a certain point in organisms with a brain, you get to a point where not only are they have this phenomenal consciousness, what something feels like, direct experience, but they can also symbolically re-represent some of that experience in their minds. And that's metacognition and self-reflection. And these two aspects are very important because when we get into the metaphysics of consciousness, the distinction between these two different aspects of consciousness will become very important. So let me stop here for a second before I go on. Does anybody have any questions? Or are you okay with where we're at so far? Okay, so let's go on. Um, so I alluded to this in the last slide. Behavior usually implies consciousness. Um, and usually behavior is a result of an external stimuli. Um, and why did nature evolve behavior? Well, obviously, to look for opportunities for food, for example, to avoid threats, danger in the environment, to pursue desires like for reproduction, for example, or just being alert with the external surroundings. These are all voluntary, tend to be voluntary acts, okay? And but that the behavior is not synonymous with consciousness. I mentioned the locked-in syndrome before, as you see down here on the bottom. There's a lot of internal focuses also. You can be visualizing or planning, you can be intending to do something, you can be dreaming, you can be doing insightful meditating or dreaming or whatever, having a mystical or a transcendent experience, but behaviorally, you're not doing anything. So you can't use behavior as, a measure of consciousness. As a matter of fact, if you like Sherlock Holmes, if you've ever read any of his stories, one of the Sherlock Holmes stories, he solved a murder because, quote, the dog didn't bark. And it turns out that the dog was in the room where this person was murdered, and the dog didn't make a sound. And Sherlock Holmes deduced that the reason the dog didn't make a sound is because he knew who the perpetrator was. So he didn't bark and as he would normally with a stranger. So the point is that behavior and consciousness are not synonymous, but clearly behavior implies that something is conscious. You know, if I ask you to blink your eyes and you blink your eyes, obviously I know you're conscious. Okay, let me make sure I didn't slip anything. Okay, yeah. All right. So I mentioned artificial intelligence before versus life, and we'll talk more about this later. But if you look at an AI system, like a computer system like ChatGPT or something like that, obviously computer systems have memory, and an AI system is trained on everything on the internet, including the good, bad, and the ugly. And usually most AI systems, if there are conflicting points of view, the consensus view usually wins. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're looking up something with AI, um, and realize that anybody can make up anything and put it on the internet, and that will be part of the training for that AI system, as well as the actual facts of whatever the subject matter is. But that's one of the reasons why AI systems hallucinate. That's where they come up with the wrong answers. It's because they've fed some bad information. Okay, so the other thing um, about AI systems do is they process information, um, and Basically, they're doing pattern matching, and it's computational. They're solving problems. They're matching patterns. They're doing an analysis of patterns, things like that. And they're looking for a certain type of pattern or consistency between different objects to come to some kind of conclusion. It's a computation, can be done by a computer. Consciousness is a state, so intelligence is a state of doing. It's a computation. And AI exhibits these first three characteristics. But consciousness uses these other things. We all have memories. We process information from the external world, or even what we have stored in our memory. Um, and we can analyze that information and come to conclusions about it. But we also have a state of being, which is called consciousness, okay, which is more metaphysical. It's something that any AI system does not have and will not have until we get to the point that we can create artificial life in a laboratory. And we'll explain more about why that is the case later on. So, um, and the consciousness can be phenomenal or it can be metacognitive and self-reflective, as we just decide. And the interesting thing about consciousness, it's what assigns meaning to information. An AI system has no idea what it's processing. It's just processing symbols. It doesn't understand what the symbols mean and what the implications. It's taking everything that human consciousness has created as stored on the internet or in books, wherever it's trained from. And, it recognizes that a certain word is usually followed by another certain word in a given context. Let's say you're talking about psychology. It has no understanding of what those words mean. Consciousness, on the other hand, is what assigns the meaning to the information that's being processed. So, and the other thing about consciousness means it's computationally irreducible. That means it can't be simulated. The only way something can be conscious is you have to let it play out. There's no shortcuts with some kind of computer simulation that can, quote, simulate consciousness. It has to be a conscious system that's just allowed to play out. And that's what computationally irreducible means. So let's talk about the ego mind. Um, Usually when we refer to the mind, we refer to the ego. And I think you all have a sense of what the ego is, that personalization, I, me, whatever you want to call it. It's basically is what's in charge during your daily life, unless you've learned how to meditate and really differentiate your pure consciousness from the ego state of consciousness. Um, anyway, consciousness is experience that occurs as a unity. In other words, there's no little bits in our mind of all these different things going on. Just look around the room you're in right now. Everything that comes in all at once is a unity of experience. There's not, well, books over there which are separate from the chair over there or the desk over there or the computer screen over there. It all is taken in all at once as a unity of experience. And as I mentioned before, it's not something that can be simulated. It's computationally irreducible. Okay, so one of the things we all know about the ego mind is it does a great job at deceiving itself, and we'll show examples of that in a minute. We don't see reality the way it is. We see the reality as the way we are. And I have some good examples for that in a minute. And we receive ourselves because the ego mind wants to protect itself. It lies to us all the time. You know, Don't believe those lion eyes, it will try to say as it tries to protect itself. Um, okay. Um, okay. And then we have the other aspect of the conscious mind. You probably noticed this. Let's suppose you're sitting in a chair reading a book and you're into the content of the book and just paying attention to the book. And then all of a sudden, you find yourself standing up, walking into the kitchen, and getting um, a glass of water. There's a lot of cognitive complexes that are operating simultaneously in your mind, but only one of them is in the focus of your awareness in your ego mind. But there are all these other complexes that are all running all at the same time. And something occurs that causes you from switch to one cognitive complex to another that's below your conscious awareness. And we'll talk more about that when we talk about some of the models of consciousness, specifically IIT in a bit. But notice that although you have these multiple things going on in the mind at the same time, in any one instant, there's only one that's in the spotlight of awareness. That doesn't mean there's not more than one thing going on. And it's how you suddenly find yourself doing something differently without ever having thought about it before. Okay. And then there are the physical correlates of subjective awareness. We all know, for example, that if somebody is being operated on and a neurosurgeon uh, puts an electrode in the brain and with a small electric current, it will stimulate memories. Okay. Uh, so clearly there's a correlate between a memory in the brain and the experience that the memory evokes by the electrical stimulation. The same thing when I raise my arm, there will be neurons firing in the brain that will correspond to the movement of my arm. And these firings are called neural correlates of consciousness, NCCs. That is a term that we'll come back to later. Very important, particularly with people who are in hospitals and intensive care with a locked-in syndrome, because right now about 20% of the people, after about 5 days, the neurosurgeon will have a meeting with the family, oftentimes right beside the patient, and say, well, there's no motor stimulation whatsoever when we try to ask for a response. So they're in a vegetative state. Let's pull the plug if they're on a respirator. Well, it turns out about 15 to 20% of these patients now are actually fully conscious, but have no motor control whatsoever. In some cases, they can control tears in their eyes or blinking, but that's about it. So people who are fully conscious, literally are listening to a discussion that's going on around them about pulling the plug while they're in a fully conscious state, but unable to move any aspect of their body. The important point of what I'm trying to say right now is that there's all these neuronal firings, electrochemical firings in the brain that occur when various things happen, when various experiences happen. But as most scientists are taught early on in their education, correlation does not imply causation any more than, if I mess around with the audio circuitry in my television set and all of a sudden the sound stops working, that doesn't mean that the sound was created by that circuit I modified in the TV set. The sound was created in the studio where the program I'm watching was recorded. So correlation does not imply causation when it comes to brain functioning, and we'll have a lot more to say about that. So here's several examples about how the mind loves to deceive itself. Quickly look at the top picture on the left. How many animals do you see?
I see four.
You see four. Okay. All right. What about you, Rebecca?
I at least four. Wait a minute. One, two.
Is that a little fly on the
There's
elephant?
actually five. There's a
Yeah.
rat, a cat, a dog, a donkey, and an elephant.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, so, it's depending on how you focus your attention. You've probably all seen this one. Here's a shadow cast on a checkerboard that's white and gray squares. And it turns out that the shade of gray is identical on every one of the gray squares. However, the ones in the shadow look darker than the ones that are in the white. So, and this is all because of our prior experience with looking at shadows and light and dark areas and things like that. Here's another example down here on the bottom. Here's an orange square, I mean, an orange circle, and here's another orange circle. Which one's bigger?
There's the same size.
Absolutely, that's correct. Because we often make comparisons based on what's relative to what we're looking at. So here you have a circle that's surrounded by bigger circles, so you tend to think of this one as smaller. But here you have the same size circle surrounded by smaller circles, which makes it look bigger. So here's another one, and just pay attention to your experience when you watch this. I think you will all recognize that there's clearly there's something that doesn't make sense there because our common everyday experience says this is impossible. Uh, a ball can't be on the top and the bottom of the surface or on the side of the surface like that, because it conflicts with our everyday experience. Now, this last one, you probably have all seen this one. Have you all seen this one? Okay. What I want you to do is there's a bunch of people throwing some basketballs around. Keep your eyes on the basketballs. Okay. Did anybody see anything unusual? Did you see the gorilla?
Yeah.
Okay. Did you all see,
Oh,
you didn't see the gorilla? Okay,
no.
watch again. He'll come in from the right and go across to the left. Even bangs his chest. See him? Right in
Yeah.
the middle. Hard to miss now. But the ego mind loves to deceive itself. And, it's all because we we all see reality different. It's all based on our belief system, our prior experiences, etc. So that's why people make such poor witnesses, for a crime or something like that. Oh, didn't mean to do that. Okay. So let's look at one aspect of mind. Let's look at memory. Um, um, your memory is way more incredible than what you probably think it is. The entire event history of everything that happened in your life is in your memory. You may not be able to recall most of it. And the way we retrieve memory is through cognitive associations. Remember the example I mentioned earlier, if you're thinking about a balloon that may lead to an association with a birthday party, and then the birthday party may lead to somebody in a clown suit, etc. The way we retrieve information is through those kind of associations. And usually what happens is most of the information about our life experiences cannot be retrieved because we lost the associations with the information, but through electrical probes, stimulation of the brains, or through other mechanisms. Sometimes you may, especially, I know for me, occasionally I think of things that have happened to me 50 and 60 years ago that I haven't thought about in all that time. And the memories are there. It's just you can't retrieve them. But with the right cognitive associations, you can get them back. And the content of the memory is about what you experienced, just like the picture we just saw of the monkey walking across while they're throwing basketballs at each other. You will recall that, not what existed in reality. So our memories are not a representation of what existed, what actually occurred, but what we experienced with our perceptual mechanisms and all our biases and beliefs and everything and prior experiences. So recent evidence suggests that memory is not stored in the brain, and I'm going to give you some real examples in a minute that are going to sort of blow you away. But one thing that I would like to just talk about for a minute is organ transplants. Have you heard the anecdotal evidence about people who have heart transplants? One woman received a heart transplant from somebody else who loved McDonald's cheeseburgers. And the woman, after she had a transplant, after she got over the trauma of the surgery and recovered, developed a craving for McDonald's cheeseburgers. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal stories like that, but just to show you, you all have heard about the white crow theory, right? Okay. You know, in science, you can never prove anything to be absolutely true. You can always falsify something. Like, for example, people used to think the earth was flat because if the earth was round, how could somebody on the, stay on the surface of the earth? They would fall off. And then Newton came along and said, well, there's this thing called the force of gravity. And that's how things, stay on the ground. And the earth is a sphere and gravity pulls equally in all directions around the sphere. So that's why things stay on the surface. And then it turned out later on, no, well, that's not the case. It doesn't account for the orbit of Mercury, which is a planet close to the sun, and the sun has a huge mass. And then Einstein came along and modified Newton's theory and said, well, there's a general theory of relativity, and that explained the motion of the planets. And, basically, models change based when we have more evidence, but they can only be falsified. You can never say that a theory or a law of science is absolutely true. And so the white crow theory says that if one white crow exists or one black swan exists or whatever it is that you're talking about, then that proves the existence that not all swans have to be white. And that becomes very important from what I'm about to show you. So let's watch this short video, and I'll give you an example about why I say that memory is not stored in the brain.
Michael and his team published a paper in 2013 about memory in planaria, these little flat aquatic worms that have a head with a nervous system entirely in their heads. All their neurons are in their heads. But they have this peculiar property that if you slice a planaria, even if you decapitate a planaria, the head grows a new body, but the body that is sliced off grows a new head. And what they did was they put a bunch of planaria in an aquarium with a substrate, complex structure in the substrate that the planaria needed to navigate to find food. And they trained the planaria to navigate that labyrinth, so to say, that maze to find food. And the planaria learned it, so they could find food very quickly. And then they proceeded to decapitate the planaria, so remove their neurons, the entire nervous system, waited 2 weeks until the planaria grew a new head with a new nervous system, clean from scratch. They put the planaria in the aquarium again to see if the planaria still remembered how to navigate the maze and find food. And lo and behold, the planaria remembered. So that's, of course, in science we need experiments to be reproduced and results confirmed. But what that experiment shows is that whatever memories are, they are not encoded in the nervous system. That's not how memories work. They're not little files inside the thumb drive in here.
Yeah.
That's not what it is.
Yeah, and the same goes for sort of the when planaria with 2 heads that he grew. If you cut off the head again, the next generation will also grow a second head, whereas the alteration is not in the DNA. So
yeah, you can alter the electrochemical environment around the living being, and their morphological organizing principles will express themselves differently, which is mind-boggling because we like to boil everything down to DNA. But our understanding of DNA is that of a protein factory.
yeah,
It's basically a brick factory. It's a factory that produces all the bricks you need.
yeah,
And what we like to think, or have liked to think so far, is that if you have a brick factory, you explain Cologne's cathedral. Well, no, you have the bricks, but something has to know how to put those bricks together in the right way, so you get Cologne's cathedral. And what Michael is doing is he's providing us an account with a lot of experimental evidence to back it up. Not strong experimental evidence only, but flabbergasting experimental evidence that takes you aback to show that what's going on here is more than just DNA. How does the cell on the tip of your thumb know to be an epithelial cell, and the cell inside your head knows to be a neuron? Because they all come from stem cells.
Yeah.
They all came from one zygote, one fertilized egg, right? So how do they know what to do and how to behave and what to look like depending on where they are? That's morphogenesis. How does this form emerge? And what it seems to suggest is that there are macro level immanent organizing principles in nature that define morphogenesis. There may be archetypal templates in nature, if you want to call it that way, that inform the form of life. In other words, that inform life. Fred Matter uses this way of using words, and he's great for this. The founder of Essential Foundation, Fred Matter, says, how do you inform life? How do you bring form into life?
yeah,
So there may be these fundamental organizing templates that are immanent in nature, immanent in life, that express themselves in the form of these fields that tell life how to structure itself.
it's crazy. It's like blueprints, and of course people
Okay, that's basically the end. The key point with the planaria and what they were talking about is that these are little flatworms that have a head that's triangular shape, and their entire nervous system is in the head. And they have a property that if you cut them in half, the tail part of the flatworm will grow a new head, and the part that had the head will grow a new tail. So what they did is they took regular flatworms, trained it to go through a maze to catch food, cut it in half, and took the tail half and put it in its own environment, in a petri dish or whatever, with nutrients. So it grew a new head, and they put that planaria in the same maze, and it knew exactly how to get through the maze to get to the food, even though its head was decapitated before it was regrown. So clearly, and there's been a lot of other experiments done since then. This is about 5 years old now. So clearly, memory is not stored in the brain. Whether it's stored in other parts of the body, well, yes, because we talked about hearts and the woman who developed a craving for cheeseburgers, McDonald's cheeseburgers, is one indication of that. But I think other experiments suggest that it even goes way beyond that, that memories are not stored in the body at all. And we'll get into a little bit of that later on.
Published Michael and
So what I'd like to talk about now, I mentioned the black swan theory, whatever. These are a lot of extraordinary cognitive abilities, and you probably have heard of several of these, but I'm going to show you some videos in a minute of a few of these. Hypothymesia is one that's very interesting, that certain people can remember every detail that happened to them throughout their entire lives. And you all heard about the savant syndrome. Sometimes people are born with exceptional abilities in one area and maybe deficient in another. They don't have to be born that way. It could happen through some kind of trauma to the brain as well. Synesthesia, you probably heard about. It's a sensory crossover where you see colors, for example. I mean, you hear colors or you see sounds. And, but most of these abilities, I mean, these are all, facts. There's, some people may say, oh, well, psi phenomena doesn't exist. Well, I would submit to you that those are mostly from materialist scientists, because according to them, where the brain produces consciousness, all these so-called psi phenomena like extrasensory perception, etc., couldn't possibly occur because they violate the known laws of physics. Well, that's a materialist perception. And you've all heard a lot of anecdotal evidence where, a loved one halfway around the world is either wounded or injured or killed or whatever. And, the spouse several thousand miles away knows something happened. And then what turns out, in the next day or whatever, they get a phone call that this person has been killed or in the hospital or something somewhere. So, most of these experiences, the materialists have no answer for except to deny that they exist. One of my favorites is terminal lucidity. These are in severe dementia patients. Their brain has become mush. I mean, the connective tissue between the neurons in the brain deteriorates and there's no longer any connection. And what often happens at end stage dementia, before somebody passes, and usually it's within 24 hours of their passing, where they actually had no recognition of the people around them, their loved ones, let alone knowing their names or being able to hold an intelligent conversation, they suddenly becomes totally lucid, recognize everybody in the room, will call them by name, have a normal conversation, and then they will pass within 10 to 24 hours after that. How can that occur if the brain is mush, if memory and consciousness is stored within a brain? So there's lots of different examples, and we'll talk more about these later when we talk about the differences between the materialist paradigm or the physicalist paradigm and the consciousness as fundamental paradigms that existing and what the implications for some of these things are. But we have to get through half of these presentations before that will really, the rationale for those phenomena will start to make sense. So let's look at hypothymesia, just to give you an example. If you've never heard of it before, this is an interesting one.
Time travelers of the mind inside the extraordinary world of hyperthymesia. Most of us forget. The scent of a childhood summer, the sound of a long-lost voice, the exact feeling of a moment slipping by. These things fade, blur, or get replaced over time. But for a rare few, memory doesn't work that way. These individuals live with hyperthymesia, an extraordinary ability to recall the days of their lives in vivid, unrelenting detail. They can tell you what they wore, how they felt, even what they ate on a random Thursday years ago. Not just the facts, but the emotions, the sensations, the color of the light in the room. It's not a trick or a party skill. It's a cognitive phenomenon that researchers are only beginning to understand. Autobiographical memory is more than recollection. It's how we stitch together our identity. It lets us relive, reflect, and even imagine what hasn't happened yet. It's deeply tied to a kind of awareness called autonoetic consciousness, the ability to mentally travel through time. For people with hyperthymesia, that mental time travel is practically effortless. Some describe their memories as being filed in visual rooms or digital folders, palaces of the mind where every moment is stored, organized, and accessible. But it isn't always a gift. Painful memories can intrude uninvited, and trivial ones pile up. Imagine not being able to forget heartbreak or even a boring Tuesday. For some, the mental archive becomes overwhelming. In one remarkable case, a 17-year-old girl described her memory system as a series of themed binders in a white room she can enter mentally at will. She stores grief in chests, anger in icy chambers, and problems in their own private space. Her brain has built a memory palace not just for recall, but for emotional control. Scientists have tested her abilities using tools designed to measure episodic recall and mental time travel. The results are astonishing. She doesn't just remember the past, she revisits it with cinematic clarity. She can even imagine future events with richer detail than most people can muster about yesterday. There's evidence this condition may be linked to heightened activity in brain regions tied to memory and visual processing. And intriguingly, hyperthymesia may also overlap with traits like synesthesia, where senses blend, though not all hyperthymestics experience it. Despite its mystery, hyperthymesia opens a door into how memory shapes the self. It challenges our...
Okay, I think we've covered enough on that one. This is going a little bit longer than I wanted. I wanted to have some time for discussion, but I would like to show you one more. This is the last one. This is somebody who became a piano savant. So if you have questions, if we don't have time to get to them tonight, just write them down, and we'll start off with a discussion of next week or the next time we meet of what we saw tonight. But this one is really fascinating. It basically, you have to ask the question, well, what happens if someday science figures out how to turn things on in ordinary people like us, that we can suddenly become a savant or a hypothymesia person? So let's watch this last.
Now we turn to a beautiful disaster. That's how a Denver man describes the indescribable thing that happened to him and changed his life forever. He's now part of a very exclusive club of instant Einsteins, hoping to inspire others with his accidental genius.
I truly believe that I am an example of the human potential.
When Derek Amato sits down at a piano, it's hard to believe he hasn't been playing his whole life. Harder still to fathom a freak pool accident made him a middle-aged musical prodigy overnight.
The accident happened 13 years ago.
Derek dove headfirst into 3 feet of water.
I miscalculated, obviously, the depth.
Sustaining a massive concussion. At the hospital,
they did a bunch of scans and checked everything. I didn't have any bleeding in my brain at the time, so they released me.
He slept for 5 days straight, and when Derek awoke, he was inexplicably drawn to a dusty keyboard at a friend's home and began to play.
It's almost like the ghost of Beethoven jumped into my body, right, and took over, and I just kind of went crazy.
He would then bring his mother into a music store to show her what he couldn't explain.
I started playing. My mom started crying. The salesman asked how many years I'd been playing piano, and I told him probably right around 7 hours.
Derek had suddenly become a savant, and according to the leading expert in the field, there are two distinct kinds.
Nickel, copper, zinc, sodium.
There's the congenital savant. These are youngsters who were born with the ability. And there's the acquired savant, and these are people who are neurotypical individuals who have some kind of a CNS incident, maybe a stroke and maybe a head injury.
In these cases, extreme left hemisphere trauma causes the right side to not only compensate, but elevate the creative center of the brain, unleashing buried.
Okay, I think we
now
got
we
the
turn
gist
to
of
a
that.
beautiful.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. So I'm going to stop sharing. I'm sorry I went for so long, but I thought those were really interesting. And remember the black swan. You can prove that not all swans are white just by finding one black swan. And the same thing exists for all those phenomena that I described a few slides back. And, you know, if we can survive through adolescence as a human race, we may figure out how to turn these things on in ordinary citizens. But it also has some profound implications for what consciousness is, what memory is, and how our consciousness really works. So, you know, we have a couple of minutes. If anybody has anything pressing they would like to say, I was hoping that we would have more discussion, but I really wanted you to see those videos to convince you that reality is really very different than we've been led to believe. And this has just been discovered, most of these things, within the last 20 years or so. So anybody have anything pressing they want to bring up?
Do you believe that consciousness is non-local then?
It's beyond space and time. So yes, by definition it is. And if you remember the meditation, that's what the meditation was trying to bring you to a place that consciousness is unbounded by space and time. We'll talk more about that later, but we have about 10 more slides to get to before we can go into the fun aspects of what a consciousness is fundamental, a metaphysics means, and what the implications are for the nature of consciousness and the nature of our consciousness and survival of death and all these other things that I am really looking forward to discussing with you. Okay, so, well, I hope you enjoyed tonight. And if you have any recommendations, if I'm going in a direction that you don't want me to go in, send me an email or say something, but I hope you're finding this interesting. Okay,
Thank you.
we'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care, everybody.
Good night.
you.
Bye-bye.